We're live. We have Edward Dodge, author, wrote. Let's
History of the
see.
Goddess, from the Ice Age to the Bible.
Yes, History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible.
Available on Amazon.
Yeah, brilliant. So here, as soon as I figure out how to put links in the description, I'll put a link to the book in the description. And yeah, and then you also wrote an article on swoon theory and a proponent of swoon theory.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was recently introduced. Well, I've always heard it in the background, right? But I talked to a mainstream scholar who's pretty much by the line every mainstream belief, right? With a lot of it saying, yeah, well, we'll never know what that was about, really, and whatnot. And then just I don't know, swoon theory came up. And then he's saying, oh, yeah, 100% swoon theory. Yeah, no, Jesus didn't die on the cross. And he's like a relatively conservative scholar, right? Although critical.
Protestant believing scholar.
No, I mean, like maybe deist.
Okay.
Right, but not Christian.
Okay.
But very, in terms of scholarship, conservative, and that blew my mind because he's like, oh yeah, we can't really know where that came from, and just really conservative. And so I thought, well, maybe there's something to it, right? And so yeah, that's the gist of that. And yeah, what's your background? And
yeah, so I wrote this book, History of the Goddess. My background, I'm just a regular guy. I'm not a scholar per se. I work in tech, and I'd been writing on tech and clean energy stuff for years. I kind of stumbled into this story. The History of the Goddess is really about, again, here's my book. It was really about Asherah in the Old Testament, and what I'd learned about scholars saying that this character Asherah was the wife of God. Now, we're not going to dwell on this. I just want to introduce what I'm talking about. And they said that she was the wife of God, which I found completely baffling and mind-blowing because it didn't jibe with anything I grew up going to church and had read the Bible plenty growing up, and I'd never even heard of Asherah or heard anyone mention her, much less say that she was the wife of God. So I was really baffled by that, and I wanted to learn more. And so I went sort of down this rabbit hole of learning who this mother goddess was. And they just real briefly, the key takeaway is that what you find out is that the historical Israelites at the time when, from 1000 BC, when they take Jerusalem, to 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, that culture was pagan. They were polytheistic. They didn't know about monotheism. They wouldn't know the concept of monotheism. And Yahweh and El, the God of the Bible, was actually two separate gods entirely. So we have two names of God in the Bible: Elohim, which comes from El, which is in English, that's God. And then you've got Yahweh, which translates in English as the Lord. So when you read in the Bible and you see the Lord and you see God, and translates back to Elohim and Yahweh, in those days, they were two separate gods. El was the ancient high god, the father of all the gods, the creator of the universe. And this was the god that the Israelites originally worshipped: Israel, Beth El, Elyon, El Shaddai. They never heard of Yahweh. Yahweh gets introduced by Moses, and it's very clear when he's at the burning bush. God says, "My name is Yahweh, but your ancestors did not know me by this name." That's because Yahweh was a new god, and Yahweh was just another pagan polytheistic god in that time period, but not just any other god. He's actually like a reform community. They want to change. They're like they're social reformers, like activists or abolitionists. They want to change what the people are doing, and the idolatry, ending child sacrifice, ending the ritual prostitution, ending a lot of things. And so that battle plays out over the entire First Temple period. And when the Babylonians come and destroy them, they had still been pagan the entire time. The northern kingdom of Israel was always pagan. The kingdom of Judah was only rarely, it was only a handful of the kings that worship Yahweh. Most of them were totally pagan. And in this context, Asherah was the mother goddess. She was the wife of El, and in my opinion, the mother of Yahweh. A lot of people say she's the consort of Yahweh. I think she's the mother of Yahweh. At any rate, part of the story is of her being overthrown and her traditions. And her traditions are the women's traditions. They're the women's religions and all the stuff that was sacred for women. And all that stuff gets overthrown. And that's speaking to women's loss of their rights and loss of their independence in the Iron Age, which is something we see in parallel in the Greeks are doing the same thing because they're contemporary culture. And so you see this narrative of women losing their rights over the course of the Bronze Age and into the Bible, into the Old Testament. And you ultimately see them like their priestesses are the Kadesha. In the Bible, they're called temple prostitutes. Actually, they're priestesses, and the word Kadesha, that's the Hebrew word, means holy. So these were the holy ones. They were very special. They had transgender priests. There's all sorts of stuff going on. They're smoking marijuana. There's all sorts of stuff going on that all gets thrown out as part of getting rid of the women's traditions and getting rid of the mother goddess so the Heavenly Father can rule alone. And this theme actually plays on into the New Testament where you, again, see the women getting thrown out. Mary Magdalene in particular was Jesus' closest companion. She was in Gnostic tradition. She is the apostle to the apostles. She's the most important character. And again, you see her thrown out of the Christian traditions. Why is she not part of the narrative of Christian history, even though she is the most important person to Jesus? She's the one who finds him. She's the one with him at the crucifixion. She's the one who finds him at the tomb, finds him risen. By all accounts, she's his closest companion. And in the Gnostic text, you see that she was, in fact, a big rival to Peter and the other disciples, that they didn't like her because she was teaching stuff that they didn't like. And so Mary Magdalene is very central to my notion of the swoon theory. So we get to the swoon theory here, which is swoon theory is basically the idea, it's a very old idea, it's not a new idea in the least, that Jesus simply survived the crucifixion. Muslims believe this. So this is not, we're not coming out of left field to have, we can debate the merits of how he survived or what the scenarios were. That's all subject to debate and conversation, which we're going to talk about here. But the idea that Jesus survived the crucifixion is both an old idea and a perfectly conventional idea, depending on your perspective. What I find interesting is that now a modern day Bible believing Christian rejects that idea for obvious reasons because it undermines their theology. But I find it interesting that most of the atheist scholars discount it as well. If you go on Myth Vision, we were just talking about the Myth Vision podcast with Derek. Those guys completely discount it. They're like, just think it's a dumb idea. Bart Ehrman thinks it's a dumb idea. All these modern scholars all mostly think that Jesus was killed, that he died naturally. He was a real person, but that he died, and that his believers were all just hallucinating or having, bereavement syndrome, they call it, where they were just so upset that they just imagined that he came back. Now, that's a reasonable, that's bereavement syndrome is a real thing. Like people do that. Like when people are upset about their loved ones being dead, that they will see ghosts and see spirits and reimagine them. There's nothing. Yeah. That's not a controversial idea. So that's a perfectly reasonable scenario. The problem with that scenario is it, in my mind, is that it makes the first generation of believers, the original generation of witnesses, it makes them out to be fools, and undermines their credibility, which I think is actually what these modern scholars are trying to do. They want Christianity to be not true. They want to undermine the credibility of the entire project, of the entire religion. So the idea of swoon theory, that Jesus survived, that leaves some opening that there's a kernel of truth that the first generation of witnesses did have credibility. Now the stories got elaborated and exaggerated and mythologized, but if the first generation of witnesses really did see this guy publicly executed and then really did see him alive a couple days or a couple weeks later, and then the stories got elaborated after that, that means the first generation of witnesses were credible and that there is some truth to all this. Like you can piece out some elements of truth behind the mythology. And I find that to be far more compelling. And then we can get into my whole scenario of how the swoon theory actually worked.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there where there's, historians kind of dismissing swoon theory. I'd probably say the biggest obstacle to accepting it would be Josephus. Like, if we know anything about Jesus, is that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. right?
Right.
With the Josephus reference. So it's almost as if, I mean, I'm not the biggest on, going after people's personal belief, like, you know what I mean? Like saying, oh, it's almost like an ad hominem,
Right.
but it would be like you're committed to historicism, right? And your biggest support for historicism, or a big support, is the Josephus reference to dying under Pontius Pilate. Or does it say die, or does it say crucified? I'd have to look back. Or is there?
I'm
But
not. I
yeah,
couldn't just
yeah.
quote it directly.
But then,
I mean, scholars aren't even sure that may have even
yeah,
itself be a forgery. So
yeah,
personally, I just stick to the gospel itself. And is the gospel text? Is there a reasonable scenario where that this guy survived? And let's go through it point by point, because there's some
yeah,
very interesting details. First of all, Jesus, his whole public ministry lasts all of a week, like from what we call Palm Sunday, when he goes into Jerusalem with the little parade. Um, and then that's like Sunday. He goes, and I think it's Monday or Tuesday, he goes into the temple and overthrows the money changers and gets everybody all upset. This is a very big political stunt. I mean, he's doing this. This
mhm,
is an intentional, attention grabbing thing that he does that is very public. All the while, he's been telling his disciples that he's going to be killed and he's going to rise on the third day. He makes this over and over again. He makes this prediction, this prophecy, and his disciples are baffled. They don't know what to make of it. But throughout the Gospels, it's pretty clear, and scholars all agree, that the disciples were kind of a bunch of rubes. Like, they're
yeah,
not that bright. Like, they're not educated. They're not like discerning. They spend most of their time being baffled by the stuff Jesus is telling them. They make it clear they don't understand what he's saying, but they
mhm,
love him and they follow him, and they, think he's a terrific guy, so to speak.
mhm,
But they're confused by everything he says. And Jesus also says that he only reveals his secrets to the people that they can understand. And well, who were the people that were really closest to
oh,
Jesus? Was the women. It was Mary Magdalene and the other women. They're the ones who are really
mhm,
closer to Jesus than the male disciples were. And Jesus gets all this flack for being friendly to all these women, because that was a countercultural thing to do in that era. To mix sexual mixing socially was not something people normally did. So Jesus gets criticized for being so friendly to all these women, and these scandalous women. So there's an implication there that if the male disciples don't know what's going on, but perhaps the women do.
yeah,
So going forward, Jesus totally knows he's going to get arrested. That Thursday night is in the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper. Jesus waits to be arrested. He's not running away. He's not fleeing. He doesn't escape into the night to try and avoid being his inevitable execution. He sits there and waits to get arrested. So, like, that again leads to believe that this whole thing is a setup, that he knows that he's got a plan, that he knows what's happening. So then that's Thursday night. Friday morning, he's put on a show trial by the Sanhedrin. He's turned over to Pontius Pilate. He gets beat up. He gets whipped. Now, the Christian tradition has him, like in the Passion plays, has Jesus being beaten within, a hair, within an inch of his life. He's
mhm,
completely sadistically brutalized. They flog him. They pull the flesh off his back, revealing the bone. But the text doesn't say any of that. If you read the text, it's totally ambiguous. There's no detail about his injuries at all. It says they hit him. It says they whipped him. They put the crown of thorns on him, made him bleed. But like none of that is like detail of brutality.
yeah,
So there's nothing that says these injuries are all that. I mean, they're bad injuries. Nobody wants to get flogged. That's not a happy day. But it's hardly a definitively fatal injury. And then he gets brought up. He gets crucified. As he's being brought up the hill, they offer him drugs. They offer him the wine of the condemned, strong drink, they call it, or the wine of the condemned is another term.
yeah,
Because what that was they would mix drugs in wine, and this is how they made medicines in that era. And it was women's business. This is something women did, not men. It was there's lots of things that were women's businesses. Weaving was women's business. Midwifery was women's business. plant medicine was women's business. This is all stuff that women did that men didn't know anything about. It wasn't part of their space.
Yeah.
And this is something that they're doing in these women's religions with goddesses and stuff. This is the stuff that they were doing in the worship of Asherah, that these priestesses were doing. It's exactly the stuff they were doing, and that, you know, gets taken away as a subject of authority. So anyway, he doesn't take the first drug, which was I think they're saying it was myrrh mixed with wine or something. The point is, he doesn't take it. He goes up on the cross. He gets nailed to the cross. Now he has additional wounds. He's been nailed through the wrists and through the feet. Again, painful, very unpleasant injuries, but not definitively fatal injuries. These are injuries you can survive. They put him up on the cross. It's Friday morning, maybe by noon at this point, and he's up there for not a particularly long time. Now, crucifixions are meant to take days. They're meant to be a slow, agonizing way to die, where you slowly suffocate to death because of your arms are up here and your lungs are getting constrained, and eventually you suffocate and die. But it takes days, and it's a completely torturous, agonizing way to die. But that doesn't happen to Jesus. What happens to Jesus? He's up there for a couple of hours, and then they give him this drink, this very suspicious drink. The wine vinegar or the sour wine, depending on your translation. And that's in 3 Gospels. 3 of the 4 Gospels have this account where he's given a beverage, mysterious beverage by unknown people. It doesn't say who gave it to him, but it's presumably the women. But no one has ever had a convincing explanation of what the beverage is. Why would you give somebody, what is sour wine? What is wine vinegar? And why would you give it to the guy? Is it meant to be refreshing? Well, why would you give refreshment to a guy who's being executed? So it makes no sense.
He's calling out for some vinegar, right?
Yeah, like why would you want to drink some vinegar? So to me, this is a euphemism for a drug, that they're sedating him. The women have fed him a drug, a potion that they have mixed up, that's their own concoction, and they knock him out. They sedate him, and they make him look dead. And in doing so, and so in the accounts, they give him the drink. He promptly succumbs. He promptly swoons. He promptly dies, quote unquote. And then they take him down from the cross. They go to see Pontius Pilate. Joseph of Arimathea goes and visits Pontius Pilate, requests that they have the body. Pilate is surprised. He says, "He's dead already?" Pilate is very surprised by this. And but they take the body down. And at this point, it's early in the afternoon. They just so happen to have this rich man's tomb nearby. Joseph of Arimathea is a co-conspirator here. He and Nicodemus is the other fellow, along with the women. He brings medicines. He's got 75 pounds of aloe and myrrh or whatever it was. 75 pounds of, they call it embalming stuff, but if you ask me, it's medicine and bandages. And they take him down from the cross. They take him down to this tomb where they can be left alone. He's under heavy sedation. He looks dead. And it's not like they had medical examiners there. It doesn't say anything in the text that they brought out the doctors and the stethoscope to examine the body closely. No, it's just a bunch of Roman guards, and who knows how close attention they're paying, or they're being bribed or whatever. The point is, the Bible is clear. He's only on the cross for a couple hours, and then they take him right down. They bandage him up. They put him in the tomb, and he lays there, in my opinion, under heavy sedation until Sunday morning. So that's Friday afternoon, Friday night. By the time they're done with everything, they have to seal up the tomb. And then Saturday is a Sabbath, so nobody comes back. And then at the crack of dawn on Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene and the other women go back. They open the tomb, find the tomb open, whatever, and Jesus is alive. Now, in my opinion, what's happening is the women have gone back and they've revived Jesus. They've been nursing him all along. They bring back more medicines too. That's also in the gospel. There's another detail there that they go back with more herbs and spices. Because everything's plant medicine in those days. All medicines are plant medicine. So there's, it's total, you're talking about the same stuff. If you're talking about embalming or, medicinal, aloe is a medicinal plant. Mm-hmm. So the point is, in my opinion, they simply revive the guy, but he's badly wounded. Clearly, these are pretty serious injuries. He's got. So, but he's alive enough to be removed. He's alive enough that people see him, that his friends and disciples come and visit, and they see this guy alive. And then it says in the gospel that 40 days later he ascended to heaven. Well, that, in my opinion, that means 40 days later he died for real. Like he succumbs to his injuries for real, and then he dies the normal, perfectly normal human death. And this whole theory is perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational. It sticks to the text closely. I don't deviate from the text at all, and it jives with medical science. The question is, are there medicines that could do that, that could actually make somebody appear dead? And the answer is yes. We've got it it's a literary trope. We've got it in Romeo and Juliet, where she takes a medicine and makes her appear dead. This appears in literature for many centuries. We have loads of examples of people, both in literature and in real life, of people being buried alive because everybody thought they were dead. People are in comas or whatever. This is just simply not uncommon at all, that people could be mistaken for being dead, especially if you're not a doctor and you're not doing a close examination. If you're just an eyewitness standing a few feet away. And so I think that it's Mary Magdalene. I think Mary Magdalene, the other women, this whole thing is a trick that they, I mean, this is not like I'm not here to declare I know the truth of what happened. It's not, this is just my notion of how it all worked and what makes sense to me. But yeah, I think that they knocked him out with a sedative, and we can talk about what that is. And then he revived, and that the women were totally at the heart of it all. And then in later generations, when the women are being removed from the church, because women were leaders in the early church, when Paul was writing his letters, the women were leaders among all the early communities, but not a generation later, and certainly not by the 2nd century, they weren't. And Robert Price, Dr. Robert Price, who I think you've talked to, he's written a whole book on this, how the women get kicked off the stage. Basically, he says it's like having their microphone cut. Like the women are up there talking, and they just like pull out the hook and like yank them off the stage. And Mary Magdalene just disappears from the narratives, from the Orthodox narratives. But in the Gnostic narratives, we got a whole Gospel of Mary, and she is very clearly the most important character. She's very clearly a big rival to Peter. Peter doesn't like her. He's very jealous of her. And so you see, and then what happens? Orthodox Christianity is Peter and Paul, and nothing to do with Mary. And the Gnostics just had an entirely different set of beliefs of a mystical Jesus with a mother goddess, Sophia as the bride of Christ. And these are all traditions that are, 1 foot in the mystery religions, 1 foot in the pagan mystery religions, all of which are like centered around mother goddesses. And this is what my book gets back to, that Asherah is just one part of this broader tapestry of mother goddess traditions, and that Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary are all picking up on that. The Virgin Mary, the Protestants criticize the Catholic Church for having the Virgin Mary. They talk about how she's just like this warmed over pagan goddess, which is totally true. She totally is. They have her all the titles: the Queen of Heaven, Mother of God, the Virgin Birth, which is a totally old trope. Totally like these priestesses, when they would do ritual prostitution, if they had a baby, the priestesses were called virgins, first of all, and so were goddesses were called virgins. So when these priestesses would have a baby, those babies were said to be virgin born, and they didn't have a father, and they were protected under law, like in Mesopotamian law. These children are sanctified, and so you have lots of historical figures that are born to these virgin mothers, and there's lots of stories about it. So it's just a very old trope that the Christians, they just syncretize that belief and make the Virgin Mary, give her all these titles, because as they're growing and taking over the pagan traditions, they've got to absorb those holidays, absorb those beliefs, and then rework them into a Christian framework. And the way they do it is to make her not a deity anymore. So the Virgin Mary has all the titles of a mother goddess, but she's just a person. But she's still the mother of God. Like, it doesn't really make sense. This is one of the many things about Christianity that doesn't make it like a sense.
Yeah, well, we could go a few places with, the whole thing doesn't make sense. That, as you were talking, a few loose ends kind of make a little bit of sense, right? Although, first thing I was like, you touched on the Virgin Mother of Heaven, right? That with Sophia, we have some Gnostic traditions have her as the mother of the demiurge, right?
Right.
Who she was the last eon, and she creates with just her. There's no, syzygy. It's just her.
Right.
And
Which is typical of the old pagan traditions, that the mother goddess came before the Heavenly Father. She's the virgin mother of all of the universe, because originally she was all alone.
Yeah.
And so she has to give birth to her own mate. And this is a trope that repeats over and over again. You see it with the Greeks, with Gaia. Gaia gives birth to Uranos. Gaia was alone. She gives birth to her own mate, Uranos, and then their children is, Kronos and the Titans. Kronos kills his father, Uranos, who is cruel. And again, the father killing the son killing his father to become the new king. That's a trope that repeats over and over again. And so you have this distinction between the Heavenly Father, El, or other names, but he's not he creates the universe, but he's not close at hand. It's his son who's the king of the gods. It was like, who is one who's the active king of the pantheon. So, and that trope repeats over and over again. And that parallels with the Gnostics, the notion of the demiurge and the monad. So, the monad is the high creator, right? The original God. And then the demiurge is his son, who's the creator of this flawed world. That actually parallels the idea that El and Yahweh are two separate gods, because El is the Heavenly Father, creator of the universe, but his son Yahweh is the creator of this flawed earth. And so that idea that when you have a polytheistic notion and you can see that different gods have played different roles in the universe, this father-son motif repeats over and over again, and it tracks the Gnostic idea of the monad and the demiurge. And then Sophia fits in there as well, just in the exact same pattern.
Yeah. And then where I was going with that, like, she's essentially, you could consider her a virgin because she doesn't have a counterpart eon like all the rest of them. And so it's striking how then we have the Virgin Mary on Earth, as if that's like intentionally mirroring each other, right? Where that's how that's how evil comes into the world, is through the virgin birth. And then there's another virgin birth where we're saved from the evil of the world, right?
Is that a Gnostic tradition, that evil comes in through the virgin birth? Or is that Garden of Eden you're talking?
That's me paraphrasing.
Okay.
But so where Sophia is the last eon, and there's 365 eons, she's the last, and she's the odd one. So she doesn't have a... So, she's the odd one, right? So she doesn't have a pair. So she creates on her own, independent of somebody else to pair with, right? So that's just me noticing that's like a virgin birth, right?
Yeah, and all of the pagan traditions, the Sumerians, Mesopotamians, they all have that the original creator was the original mother, the great salt waters, because they believed that that life emerged from the oceans, which is in fact biologically true. Life on Earth does emerge from the oceans, and so they posited that the origins of all life were the great salt waters, was the mother, and it's different stories in different traditions, but they all start with, so in the Babylonian, the Enuma Elish, it's Tiamat. Tiamat is the original mother. The earlier than that is Sumerians, and their mother goddess is Nama, I think, and she gives birth to everything. She gives birth to On, who's the same as El, and the other creator gods. And so all these traditions, this is one of the innovations of the Hebrews, is that they're taking away the mother goddess, and they say that the father created everything all by himself with the snap of his fingers. This was a huge radical shift from the standard beliefs of the era, which is where there was a mother and father together, and the mother came first. The notion there's no mother at all is a radical shift of theology and culture, and it reflects the rising patriarchy and the loss of rights and authorities by women. Because women, the farther back in history you go, the more independence and authority women had in the communities. And when you go back to the
Mhm.
Neolithic, women had lots of authority. And over the course of the Bronze Age, which is the rise of kings and the rise of armies and the invention of weapons and the beginnings of
Mhm.
slavery, the women and the holy women, they lose their rights over not in one day. It's over like a couple thousand years, but you can track the evolution in the evolution of laws, like Mesopotamian laws, and in the mythology. You see how the goddesses lose their powers. Ishtar, who was the most popular goddess of the Bronze Age, from Babylon, she is a complete badass. She doesn't not subservient to any male figure. She's not subservient to her husband. She's not subservient to the king of the
Mm.
gods. She's the queen of heaven, but she's not married to the king of the gods. She's an independent character. She's not subservient to her father, to the king of the creator of the universe. She goes into his realm and challenges him and takes some of his authority for herself. She doesn't listen to her husband. She casts her husband to hell. She doesn't listen to anybody. She is a totally independent and ambitious character unto herself. And that's Astarte in the Old Testament. There's two goddesses named in the Old Testament, Asherah and Astarte. And Astarte is the one that King Solomon is worshiping. And Astarte is the same as Ishtar, the same goddess. And
Got it.
and she is this goddess of love and war, and she's super sexual, but she's also a warrior, and she does divination and prophecy. And so yeah, she's super powerful and she was super popular. And the Greeks and the Hebrews, they all seek to like demote and devalue her. And the Greeks, they take her powers away as well. She's in the tradition of Aphrodite, except for Aphrodite, for the Greeks, is not a warrior goddess. She's just the sex goddess. And all of her war powers have been taken away and given to Athena. All the powers of wisdom and divination and leadership and war, that's all given to Athena, who's asexual, who's totally chaste,
Mhm.
and a virgin. But when you go back earlier than that to Ishtar, she has all those powers in one. She's Athena and Aphrodite combined. So she's sex and war and totally tough and
Yeah.
not taking shit from anybody.
Yeah. So what would you say is the reason for like women taking like a smaller role over time?
I think it's centuries of warfare,
Yeah.
centuries of invading armies, marauding through, and simply having no respect for women. And eventually, you get to a point where women get blamed. We can only theorize, but one thing that you can see for sure is that both the Greeks and the Hebrews have, for the Hebrews, have the character Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the Greeks have the character Pandora. In both cases, that's the first woman, and they're the source of all trouble and source of all sin, source of everything that's wrong in the
Mhm.
world is because of the women. Once women came along, oh man, all things went to hell. And so they use these stories, and in the West, we have used the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden as explicit reason to subjugate women. Say, why do we have to keep women subordinate to men? Because of the Garden of Eden and the instructions of the Garden of Eden. Um, and so, and the Greeks were similarly patriarchal and kept their women locked up tight.
Oh, sorry about that. That's my son needs something real quickly here.
It's all right.
All right. So, yeah, along those lines, you bring up war as the reason for like kind of women taking a smaller role and men taking a bigger role. That I've heard it explained that
Can you hold?
all right, thanks for that. So, my thoughts are that it starts as women becoming more important, right? In that, so let's say it's more of a warlike society, right? And you want your society to survive, right? So one man can bring an entire civilization to its next generation, right? A man can impregnate thousands of women potentially, right, in one generation. But you need all the women, right? Because a woman can only have one well, I guess you can have twins, but like the women are the limiting reagent, right? And so like if it comes down to like brass tacks that yeah, we're in trouble, like there's wars, like everything's terrible, we're going to have to triage everything, right? We need to protect the women, make sure all of them live, and then men can do the battling, right? Because right? And then so who's active and who's passive in that, right? The men are active, the women are passive, right? So yeah, sorry.
You need some video games there, Elliot. You got to like raise him right with a stick and iPad in his face and have him play, Minecraft. 21st century parenting.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's yeah, I couldn't figure it out how to do it. Oh, but I guess okay. Okay, so let's see, I lost my train of thought there.
You were talking about warfare and stuff, and so here's the thing: like,
Okay, yeah.
in the Neolithic, we've got thousands of years of Neolithic settlements from 12,000 years ago up until the beginning of the Bronze Age, which is like 4,000, 3,500 BC. And all during the Neolithic, there's no evidence of warfare. And all the evidence we have is of egalitarian cultures where women were treated equally to men, and the women had a lot of rights and authority. And there's no kings, there's no class society, there's no armies, there's no slaves. All that stuff begins with the Bronze Age. And what happens with bronze is you get the invention of weapons, invention of tools, but also specifically the invention of weapons. And at this point in history, the settlements had become prosperous enough that there was something worth stealing. And so when you get the invention of weapons, it only takes a small number of murderous men to come through and start killing people and enslaving the survivors, subjugate, stealing the women, stealing all their stuff. And that becomes the fast track to wealth in the Bronze Age, is to slaughter your neighbors and subjugate them. And so that creates this cycle of violence where every given community now has to arm themselves to defend themselves against the marauding neighbors. Now, all this slavery has nothing to do with racism or anything, because they're literally enslaving their neighbors. And it's over this time period. So in the beginning, and we go back to the oldest mythology, when at the beginning of the Bronze Age, when writing was first invented, and we get our first pantheons of the gods with the Sumerians, the goddesses are at their highest power. And at this point, we have maternal bloodlines. This is key too, is maternal bloodlines versus paternal bloodlines. When you're tracking birth through the mothers, it doesn't really matter who the women are having sex with, because you're not concerned about the seed. This is a huge transition that happens in the Iron Age. Iron Age is like the first millennium, so 1000 BC going forward. That's the Iron Age. Both the Greeks and the Hebrews are very intent on imposing paternity and imposing patriarchy. This is a big theme in the Bible, is that we're going to track our family lines to the fathers. And it's a theme in Greek mythology as well, and it's an innovation. It's something new that they're doing because they weren't doing it before. And this is where you have to start controlling your women's sex lives. You have to control your wives, control your daughters, because they were very clearly not doing that before. This is one of the huge criticisms that the Hebrew prophets have of the Canaanites and of the Israelites, is that the women are all running around and they're having all this sex and all this non-monogamous sex, and that they're not monogamous with their husbands. This is why it's in the Ten Commandments. And they tell Eve specifically, you shall only desire your husband. Well, why are they saying that? Because the women at the time didn't do that. The women at the time were running around, and so were the men. Everyone's having lots of sex. It was a big part of the culture. These are fertility cults that the scholars call them. They're all about the growth of plants, and they believed in magical terms that sex makes the flowers grow, and the entire culture has to have as much sex as possible so that they can grow, that will promote fertility and life and growth of plants. This is why they have ritual prostitution in the temples. In King Solomon's temple, they're having ritual prostitution because these traditions are all about the feminine and about the mothers and about growing plants. At the end of the day, these are the farmers, and farmers and shepherds are the two different groups. The shepherds are the Hebrews are these shepherding clans, of patriarchal shepherding clans, and the farmers are the people living in the towns worshiping the goddesses and having all of these illicit traditions, what we would consider illicit behavior. It's sex and drugs and music and dance and partying. And that's what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so God punishes the entire city for their illicit lifestyles. And the shepherding Israelites are saying, look how bad those people were. And that's why God punished them. And so they want to change. That's one of the things they want to change. They want to institute paternity. They want to have everything tracked through the fathers. And that means they have to control the women's sex lives and control the women's behavior. And this is a theme that runs through the book of Hosea. Is all about this. Hosea and his wife Gomer. Gomer is one of these Kadeshas. It doesn't say so explicitly, but she's almost surely a Kadesha priestess. She's got children by different men. And Hosea's got to go win her back by giving her some money and getting her to come back to him. And then he locks her down. And we never hear her voice, mind you. We never hear her opinion. Mm-hmm. And over and over and over again with Jeremiah, with Ezekiel, all these prophets are castigating the women for flaunting themselves and running around. And then when they come back for the second temple with Ezra, one of the main things that happens is he finds that the Jewish men have been marrying Canaanite women, and he's very upset about it. And he tells them that they've got to divorce the Canaanite wives and abandon their families. Well, why? What were they doing that was so bad? It's because the women they're marrying have all these other traditions and that are going to be completely incompatible with paternity and patriarchy. And if you want to have, you got to raise your daughters in the right way that they believe this stuff. Because if the daughters are raised with their mothers telling them, you can go be a priestess in the temple and have your fun, that is something the Hebrews are totally opposed to. And it's one of these cultural traditions that are trying to turn over. And so it's all this stuff about taking women's authority away, locking them down so they don't have any independence, taking away their property rights, and ultimately eliminating their spiritual traditions altogether.
Yeah. Do you think it had some survival benefit as to what motivated them?
No, I think it's just purely men taking power for power's sake.
For no reason? Like very, very, they're like the Sith. Like,
self-aggrandizing power and wealth. Like, I don't think that's what people do today. I don't think people are any different back then. People steal because they want the stuff. Why does anyone invade some other foreign place? You take the land, you take their wealth, and you bring it back to your place. I mean, and the alternative is that your other neighbors are more powerful than you and they do it to you. It's like, it's a binary choice. Either you're strong enough to whip your neighbors and subjugate them, or they're going to subjugate you. Like, there's not really much middle ground. You have to be strong enough to defend yourself. And we all know that by and large, men are the better fighters. I mean, there are some women warriors, and there definitely were women warriors in the ancient world. The Amazon warriors was a real thing. So in certain cultures, they had lots of women fighting, but that goes away over time.
Yeah.
Because
So I mean, it's really cutthroat.
Totally.
So we'll say, the women, we're going to lock them up. We're going to keep you safe. And now we're going to go fight and invade and defend ourselves too. And
bring back some more women.
Yeah. And then, because women are very valuable in societies like those because everybody's dying. Right. And so you
make a valid point about like, you do need to protect the women just to like protect like, childbirth and such. But that's separate from women having independence. And, in indigenous cultures, they don't track bloodlines through the fathers. They track bloodlines through the mothers. I mean, lots of cultures track bloodlines through the mothers and aren't concerned about paternity. The father would be a social father, not, the biological father. Like people just didn't care. They didn't, I think they perfectly understood the nature of pregnancy and how women got pregnant, but they weren't concerned about that it was going to be the seed that was more important. The Greeks are very explicit about this. There's an important Greek myth about how Athena makes this ruling that it's the father's seed that matters, and the woman is an anonymous vessel for the father's all-important seed, and that is this huge shift. And it's this place where women are losing their rights. There's also strong implications that royalty was passed through the daughters, and that for a king to take over and take the throne, he had to marry the princess. This is the behind the story of Helen of Troy, that there's a whole theory that when Helen of Troy, for the Trojan War, and that she was married to, Menelaus. Do talk about, familiar with the Iliad and the Trojan War?
Only vaguely. Yeah, I'm not.
All right.
I'm
Well,
not
I won't dwell on, but Helen of Troy, she gets taken away, and that launches the Trojan War. And in our telling to the stories, the way it is, if you read the Iliad, it's just because she's a pretty face. She's the most beautiful woman ever, and that's why Menelaus is so upset. But there's indications now that actually there's more to the story, that actually these women, Helen and also her sister, who's another character, Clytemnestra, that they were actually the key to the throne. And so when Menelaus, when his wife gets kidnapped, he actually loses legitimacy as king, and he needs to fetch her back in order to maintain his legitimacy on the throne. But again, the Greeks want to change these stories because they want to take away the women's rights too. So they scrub that bit out and just make it, oh, she was so beautiful that he was upset about it. But really, it was actually there was actually more political implications to it.
Got it. And do you think, like with the Pentateuch, that was kind of retroactively made up? Or do you think that the whole, like the shift from like egalitarian religion versus kind of a masculine religion was right, like during the time of when Abraham was said to have lived? Or
yeah, I think that this is the women are losing their rights slowly but surely over like a couple thousand years. So by the time you get into where Abraham, which is like a late Bronze Age character, a couple things about Abraham and the patriarchs is that they weren't worshiping Yahweh; they're worshiping El. This is very clear. When Jacob gets the name Israel, it's Israel, not Israel. If it was Yahweh, it would have been Israel. Scholars have long noticed this. It's Israel. And the first thing he does, the very first thing he does after getting that name, if you know the story, he wrestles with an angel or this mysterious figure that people describe as an angel. And then they give him the name Israel because the word Israel means wrestles with or contends with, fights with, battles with El. And then he goes to and this takes place in the town of Bethel, which means house of El. And then the first thing he does is build an altar in Bethel, and he writes on the words. In English, it says God is the God of Israel. But in Hebrew, it says El. It says El Eloi Israel. El is the God of Israel. Not Yahweh is the God of Israel. It says El is the God of Israel. And at this stage of history, they're polytheistic. They've got El. They're worshiping El and all the rest of the gods. Baal was the son of El, who was the incumbent king of the gods. Yahweh comes to challenge Baal to be the new king. They've got Asherah as the mother goddess, who is now Asherah appears 40 times in the Old Testament, and most of the references are as a carved wooden pole, a totem pole, just like Native American. And so the Asherah pole is this pole that stands next to the altar of the king of the gods, not as his consort, but as his mother, because the mother is the one choosing. If you read the Ugaritic text, which is the one bit of mythology we have that talk about El and Asherah and Baal, it's clear that Asherah, that whole story is about how Baal rises to become king of the gods in their pantheon. It's Asherah who's making the decision, and then El stamps it with his authority. And so Asherah is very, very, close at hand. And so, and in the Bible, you see that these Asherah poles stand next to the altar of Baal. And so when the Hebrews will come along to smash the altars of Baal and cut down the Asherah poles, that happens over and over again in Judges, and it happens throughout the Book of Kings with the reforms of King Hezekiah and the reforms of King Josiah. They smash the altars of Baal and cut down the Asherah poles. But then these are very unpopular reforms, and as soon as that king is gone, the next king promptly brings them all back and brings back the Asherah poles. There was an Asherah pole in King Solomon's temple, and archaeologists have now found shrines and altars where you've got an altar of Yahweh standing next to the altar of Asherah and inscriptions of Yahweh and his Asherah. And archaeologists have now found this stuff. So they know that Yahweh this is all first temple period prior to the Babylonian destruction, that Yahweh was being worshipped alongside Asherah and that Asherah was the mother goddess. And so I don't know where I was going with that, but that's going on the entire time. And all right, so, oh yeah, back to the Bronze Age. So
Mhm.
Abraham, you see in these stories that they've got these Kadesha priestesses. You see the story of Judah, where Judah and Tamar. Do you know this story where he impregnates her? Tamar was one of the Judah is one of the patriarchs, one of the brothers of Joseph, the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah is where we get the name Judah, and he is he's involved with the story of Joseph and everything, but he has this other story where he's got this daughter-in-law, Tamar, and who's married to Judah's son, but Judah's son dies before they have a child. And so Judah promises Tamar that she can marry the next son, the second son, but that second son would be responsible for any children. They would be his brother's birthright, but he would be responsible for raising him. So he doesn't want to impregnate her. So he has sex with her, but always, doesn't,
Oh,
he spills his seed on the floor, and there's a term for
yeah.
it. Um, and then, and then he dies. And Tamar is very upset about all this because she still hasn't had a child. So she hasn't secured her place in the household. And then Judah promises the third son to Tamar. But at this point, Judah is very nervous because both of his older brothers, his first two sons have died after
Mhm.
marrying Tamar. So like he's reluctant to give the third son to Tamar. So this goes on for some years. And then Tamar tricks Judah. She knows he's years have gone by. Now Judah is now a widower. He's going to go to the festival, and she knows that he's going to shack up with one of these prostitutes. And so she goes out. And one thing that these Kadesh prostitutes did was that they were hidden behind veils and anonymous. And so she's got a veil of her own, and she goes out where she knows Judah's going to be, and waits for him to come by, and they hook up, and he impregnates her. And then later on, it gets revealed that this is what happened, and that she gets impregnated, and that she had tricked Judah a little bit, but then she reveals herself as actually an honorable woman, and Judah is forced to apologize, and she gets to stay in the household, and is in her honor is there, and she has a child. Now, in an English text of the Bible, you don't catch these details because the King James Bible does not distinguish between a temple prostitute and a brothel prostitute. But in Hebrew, they're two separate words. Zona is the word for like a street prostitute, like a hooker. But
Mhm.
a Kadesha, the holy ones, is a different word. But in the King James Bible, it just calls them all harlots and does not distinguish between them. More modern translations will call them temple harlots, which is only slightly better, but at least distinguishes between a conventional harlot and a temple harlot. But none of them ever call them the holy ones. You'll never see an English text of the Bible that talks about these priestesses as their proper name, which is the holy ones. But if you read the story of Judah and you go back and look at the beauty of doing this scholarship now is on the internet, even if you don't read Hebrew, you've got all these automated translations into Hebrew, and you can just do word searches by Hebrew. Like BibleHub.com was my favorite,
Mhm.
or BibleHub.org, whatever it is, Bible Hub. You can go verse by verse and read all these multiple English translations, but you can also do the Hebrew translations and get all the reference books, the concordances, and all this stuff that will give you all of the scholarly information about every single word, all the dictionaries and everything. And you can see every single time that this word is being used, and you can track every single time the word. Like you can do a word search by Kadesha, find every single time that there's a mention of a Kadesha in the Old Testament. And what you see is that they're there throughout the entire First Temple period.
Mhm.
And there's a male counterparts, the Kadesh, who are transgender. These are the equivalent of the Galai priests of Rome who would castrate themselves in service of Cybele, who's another mother goddess. This is a tradition throughout the Near East of men castrating themselves and as these transgender priests. They're there as well. They get mentioned three
Mhm.
times, and the only times they're mentioned is when they're being chased away by the followers of Yahweh, who really don't like them very much. Just like they don't
Yep.
like LGBTQ trans people today. They didn't like them back then either because they're part of these rival traditions. They were celebrated in the ancient world. Trans people were
Yeah.
in the context of goddess worship.
Yeah.
But in the context of patriarchy, they're not, they're despised basically. Um,
Yeah.
but you see these priestesses all the way through the first temple period, but they don't come back in the second temple.
Yeah. And reminds me of the passage in Luke, right, where there are men that are born queer from their mother's womb, men that are made queer by men, men that make themselves queer and then make themselves queer for the glory of the kingdom of God. Right?
Exactly. No, that is a very explicit reference. And actually, the term is castrati. They're castrated. Some
Mhm.
men are castrated against their will as children to go serve in a royal household because eunuchs, we're talking about eunuchs here. So some people are eunuchs, made eunuchs, not by their own choice. So the people that go serve in the royal household. And eunuchs have played very important roles. Some are born that way because there are some that are like genuinely, there are hermaphrodites and intersex,
Yeah.
biologically intersex people. This was documented in the ancient world. And then some are eunuchs in the service of God, more explicitly in the service of the goddess, because these traditions were goddess traditions. These were mystery religions and traditions were of Asherah and Astarte. Ishtar was herself transgender. She celebrates it. There's all this mythology of Ishtar in Mesopotamia, where she is turning into a man, where she turns men into women. I'm the one who makes men into women and women into men. And they have all these trans priests and they celebrate it. But yeah, men would, just like a modern day man choosing to change his body to a woman, that's what they did back then. The equivalent back then was to castrate yourself, and men
Yeah.
would do it voluntarily in religious contexts.
Yeah, I've heard castrati can also refer to just a man that's seen as uh, quite effeminate.
Yeah,
That's
yep.
just not. I mean, there's no like
Yeah, you don't
anything
necessarily have
done.
to be
Yeah,
act physically castrated. Yeah, there's some men that are just super femme. We have them today, like they're around today.
yeah,
Um, and so yeah, it's same thing. Whether they're biologically intersex or just mentally intersex, however you want to describe it. And then but it was a real tradition of being eunuchs. Like they have tools to do it, because like you got to do it correctly or else you bleed to death. So there's a technique to how you do it properly. And this is documented for thousands and thousands of years.
yeah. And then within the Gnostic tradition, they're saying women making themselves into men. That there's the mother father who's the monad, right? And there's, I think, what in the epistles they say there's no gender in heaven, right? So the more, I don't know, fluid you can make yourself, the better off you are, right? Well, if you
Yeah, yeah,
want
no,
to,
it's celebrated. Dionysus is transgender, and for the Greeks,
mhm,
he would pretend to be a woman all the time, and he's super gay. Like Dionysus is like, he's not just the god of wine and intoxication. He's like the god of ritual sex. He's the god of gay sex. He's super gay. Um, and
mhm,
yeah, like all these traditions are over and over and over again. And I've talked to trans people about this. Modern day secularists just don't care about this stuff. And so I've tried to make this point that like
mhm.
you guys had like these really sacred special roles in the ancient world, um, in a spiritual terms, and they like just don't really grok or really even want to engage in the conversation. Um, yeah, because like the whole left today is all very atheistic, and so they're
Mhm.
really rejecting religion and spirituality, and even don't want to engage in it to even
Yeah,
reimagine it. They just want to reject the entire thing.
yeah, and it's, yeah, I agree. And then on the conservative side, I don't know what's going on. I think it's it's wanting to keep things simple, right? That just there's I always hear there's men and then there's women. That's it, right? And then I'm
Right.
not
Well,
even, yeah,
yeah, no, the Christians explicitly reject the transgenderism. It's a threat because it brings you back to these traditions. It's the same thing with the plant drugs. Why do Christians hate psychedelics and marijuana? Because these are part of these goddess traditions. They were totally doing all this plant drugs and psychedelics in the mystery religions and the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece. They were totally doing it. They're totally burning weed in King Solomon's temple. They're
Mhm.
totally burning it to Asherah. This is a big theme of my book, was that cannabis is all over the place and was very, very sacred for the goddesses. And then when they
Yeah.
throw the goddesses out, they throw those traditions out with them, partly because it's of the sex. Cannabis is a real aphrodisiac, and it promotes sexuality. And so they don't want, especially for women, and they don't want women running around being sexual. And so, and psychedelics are give you this like um, it's like a very spiritual experience, and people have talked about this for many centuries, and it's a way to commune with the divine that bypasses the priests and that bypasses the institution. It gives you a personal connection to God, which some of the Gnostics were all about, but that the Catholics were totally opposed to, because the Catholics, for the Catholic Church, they wanted to mediate your passage to the divine. Everything needed to come through the institution, through the priests. You're forbidden from having your own personal relationship to God. This is a huge part of the Protestant Reformation, was to bring back the idea of having your own personal revelation. That is not a Catholic idea. That is a Protestant idea. It's also a Gnostic idea.
Mhm.
And now the Protestants didn't do plant drugs, but plant drugs are part of this story as well. Indigenous people are doing plant drugs. So the indigenous people love all the psychedelics,
Mhm.
but the Christians hated it. They've hated it for centuries. And
Yeah. Well, yeah, a few thoughts on that is that it's interesting how wine survives, right? So wine has, as an intoxicant or however you want to refer to it. It's interesting that that survives, right? And you kind of
right.
wonder why. Because it's like blood, I guess, and I guess drinking blood is okay.
It's they don't actually, they only get rid of certain stuff. And they only feel threatened by certain things. They're not threatened by
Yeah.
tobacco.
Yeah.
But they felt very threatened by marijuana, and they felt very threatened by psychedelic mushrooms when they found Native Americans doing peyote rituals in the 1800s. The Christians were very threatened by that and shut it down. Mexican Catholics in the 1700s and 1800s were very, very threatened by indigenous plant traditions. So it's a theme. It's a theme you see, but yeah,
Mhm.
you're right. They embraced alcohol, but alcohol is an inebriant, but it doesn't give you the same kind of spiritual experience that psychedelic mushrooms will give you. I don't know if you have experience with psychedelics, but like it's a
I
very,
don't.
very transcendent experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Ayahuasca.
yeah. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I know, what is it? St. Peter's cactus? Is that what it's called?
I don't know
Um,
what that is.
so it's in Spanish for St. Peter. So like St. Peter has the keys to the kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it was that you could kind of peer into heaven.
Right.
What is it? Saint Pad.
Now
There's
you'll
a
find you can
yeah,
find examples of mystics throughout Christian traditions, individual on an individual basis, who do mess around with this stuff. And there are Christian mystics all the way through history but they generally run counter to the Catholic institutions. And there was, in the Middle Ages, this was like very, very dicey territory. You could get killed for this kind of thing. I mean, they executed heretics and they executed blasphemers. And so you start messing around with occult stuff in the Middle Ages,
yeah,
and you run afoul of the priesthood, they're going to execute you. And
yeah,
we have documentation of people messing around with magical stuff and plant drugs in the Middle Ages and are being very, very nervous about it. They're writing in code. And you have examples of them getting caught and getting executed. I mean, they persecuted witches for centuries. 80,000 women, mostly women, were murdered over a 300 or 400 year period for witchcraft.
yeah,
As a large part of that is plant medicine. I mean, that's what women were doing, is they're messing around with, they're making concoctions. That's women's business. Men didn't do that stuff. Women were the guy. It was women who were in some shack in the woods with all sorts of herbs and cooking up all sorts of recipes. That's mostly 90% women.
Why do you think it was a women's thing and men weren't really doing it?
Well, I just think it goes back to the whole homemaking, child rearing, aspect of womanhood. You know, women were midwives. There were just certain things that life and death was women's business. They did the mourning and the funerals.
Yeah.
They wrap the dead bodies. They serve hospice to hold the hands of the dead as they're dying, and they were closer with the planting. I
Right.
just think that like this is just women's tradition that they're men had
Yeah.
other stuff to do.
Yeah, I think, if like expanding on the whole war thing, that war and death was for the men, and then women tend to the dead, and also the births, right? You wonder if that plays a role. And
Oh yeah,
it's
no, like these
yeah,
goddess traditions are all cycle of life traditions. They're life, death, rebirth. They're all about it. That's what the dying and rising god myths are all about. Every single one of them, the god that dies is raised back by a goddess. The exception is Christianity. The exception is Christianity that is
oh
raised by the god, but all the other ones, every single time, whether it's Ishtar and Dumuzi, or whether it's Demeter and Persephone, or whether it's Isis and Osiris, the character that dies is always raised back by goddess, by the
yeah,
power of the mother goddess. And this is again speaking to women's traditions of the cycle of life, and
yeah,
and Christianity usurps that, changes it from a cycle of life tradition to an eternal life tradition, removes the goddess and gives that power to the God, to the Father, who traditionally did not do that. That was not traditionally the Heavenly Father's role. Um,
yeah. And you wonder if with the women at the tomb, right? If maybe in that tradition somebody is looking at it and saying, well, there has to be women at this resurrection, or at least like the story just needs that, right? Because they're familiar with the other traditions. So they have women at the tomb after he's risen, right?
You could make that argument. You could definitely make the argument that it's purely literary, that the women are placed there because it was women that hung out in graveyards. Like it was a thing. Like there was professional, like women would be professional mourners. Like they would hang out, and for whatever funeral was coming along, you pay them some coins, and they would sing for you and do all the ritual stuff that was required in a funeral. That was another women's business. So you could make that case that the women are there purely on because that was again a women's thing, or you could argue that they actually were the actual friends of Jesus,
Sure.
and that this is actually a kind of a dying and rising God motif in real life, where it's the women who raise Jesus and raise him to the divine, turn him from a man into a god by the powers of the women and their mystery plant medicines. This would be like a
Yeah.
Gnostic pagan way of interpreting that story. I wrote up a version I called Gnostic Mystery Jesus, and I'm like, this whole
Hmm.
story is can be reinterpreted as a mystery tradition in real life, that the women raised Jesus, the human Jesus, and turned him into a god because they were the ones who brought him back to life from death, or appeared to do so. But at any rate, it was the women who deserve all the credit. Um,
Hmm.
they weren't just there by accident. They weren't just witnesses to the resurrection. They were responsible for the resurrection.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember kind of I'd mentioned like loose ends that kind of are tied up under the swoon theory, right? Where Rabbi Tovia Singer mentions that this narrative makes no sense in the Jewish tradition,
Right.
that it's only for like the funeral that you put the herbs and all that stuff and put like the aromatic things to make the body smell good, because there's no embalming. The body is going to stink terribly, right? And so during the funeral, you're going to want to put as much strong smelling herbs all over the place to cover it up. And so returning to the tomb the next day after the burial with herbs defeats the whole purpose of the herbs, right? And you would never do that because it's going to be putrid, and it's going to there's zero reason to return to the tomb with herbs. In fact,
But if you're returning to the tomb
Yeah.
because this guy's actually alive and these are actually medicines that you're going to bandage his wounds, again, then it makes a lot of sense what they're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I remember there's an IT conference on internet security, right? And you win this big prize they have in the conference room. They're going to lock up, connect this computer to the internet. If you can hack into that computer, you win a big prize, right? If you can
Okay.
get malicious software onto it. And so that's the big challenge. And like this computer is secure. It has all the security software and everything, right? And so the winning team that actually did it by convincing the security guard, we need to get in there real quick for this presentation tomorrow. We really need to get in. If you could let us in. And he's like, well, I'm not supposed to let you in. Nobody can get in. Well, I mean, we're just going to be there for 15 seconds. If you could we just really need to get in there. Right. And then the security guard lets them in, upload the malicious software. They got it. Right. And so if kind of the parallel is the women come to the tomb, it's guarded by Roman soldiers, right? According to the narrative. Maybe it's not. But there's people that are going to look at them funny, right? And they say, yeah, it's just a Jewish custom that we have, that we need to put herbs on the body. And then they're like, all right, if it's reverence for the dead, then okay, have at it, right? We can kind of make that case where that's kind of the cover story, even though like the Roman soldier knows next to nothing. Maybe they know that little bit about it, that there's herbs with the dead, right? So that's their story, and that's their in to get into the tomb.
Right.
And,
yeah, I mean, that whether the tomb was guarded by the Roman soldiers is totally ambiguous. It's not clear that it is or is not. But even if it was guarded, they easily could have been bribed or whatever. Joseph Arimathea was a rich man. They had other assistants. They may have had help on the inside. It's easy. It's pretty easy to explain away the guards, considering that it's not even clear there were any guards anyway. But yeah, I just think that this whole notion of there's the whole theme of my book is how you can see in mythology the roles that women once had and the authority women once had culturally and mythologically, and that you see that taken away, and then in the transition from paganism to monotheism in the biblical context, it's literally the divorce and overthrow of the wife of God. That God once had a wife. We call her Mother Earth today. She didn't go away. Heavenly Father, earthly mother, they were the divine couple. So the mother gets demoted. She gets knocked off her pedestal. She gets taken out back, beaten up, raped, and locked in a closet. But she didn't die. She didn't go away. She's still part of the culture. But there's kind of a spiritual hole in Western culture, I think, where the mother goddess used to be.
Yeah. And maybe on some archetypal level, we're kind of realizing that. And you kind of need to fill that in with the Virgin Mary. Maybe.
Well, I mean, that's the role the Virgin Mary plays culturally in the Catholic and, all through Catholic history. The Virgin Mary is like the most important part of like the day-to-day life of your average Catholic. I mean, they didn't read the Bible. They weren't literate. They weren't encouraged to read the Bible. The Mass was in Latin. They didn't actually know much of anything about the Bible. Your average Catholic from the 4th century up until the Protestant Reformation never read the Bible. They had no access to it. They didn't know the verses because the Mass was all in Latin. So like they're completely ignorant. But the Virgin Mary is like this really, really important part. Like that's where they make their daily prayers. And the role of the Virgin Mary is to intercede on your behalf and go take your messages up to the High Father, because he's kind of distant and far away. This is another repeating theme, that the mother goddess is close at hand. Mother Earth you can touch Mother Earth. You can taste Mother Earth. You can wrap your fingers and toes, and it's very intimate experience. The Heavenly Father, he's like out in space, like forming the cosmos, wrestling with black holes and building suns and building galaxies. He's not worried about us. We're scum, biological, bacterial scum on the surface of the planet. He doesn't care about us. I don't personally think, not as individuals. And that's why like I think this is part of the innovation of the Israelites, is that in the Mesopotamian traditions, El was named On, and he had kind of fallen out of favor of being worshipped in favor of the king of the gods, the other gods that are closer at hand. And On falls out of favor, and his worship starts to go to the wayside. The Israelites bring that back. They're like, we're going to make El our central guy now, and we're worshiping the Heavenly Father. Then that's why they call themselves the Israelites, but they're still polytheistic. It's only later, after the destruction by the Babylonians and in the Babylonian exile, that Yahweh and El are fused together into a single God. And that is the Heavenly Father ruling alone with no mother goddess at all. And they rewrite the whole history of the world, that it's been like this since forever, and there never was a mother goddess, and you don't know anything about her because we're not going to tell you anything about her. And the only time we're going to mention her is to denigrate her and like despise her, basically.
Yeah. And it's also a bit of Mormon theology where they talk about like there's Heavenly Father and there's also Heavenly Mother, but they never really talk about Heavenly Mother.
Yeah, even as a child, I was like in church, and as a kid, I was like, why is it Father, Son, and Holy Ghost? Like, where's the mother? Why is there no mother? This is not like a radical idea. Humans are like, the idea of a mother and a father, like, is a pretty natural idea that humans have always had. In Hindu traditions, the gods come in pairs. They're always in pairs, a husband and wife team. And it's unique to the Abrahamic faith that it's all father and no mother, and there's no sexuality. This is an utterly unique thing to biblical traditions.
And then, bringing up Hinduism, where there's always the pair, right? And I can think of a counterexample with Ganesh, right? He doesn't have a pair because he's asexual, right?
Okay.
And
I shouldn't overly generalize every single guy, but like most of them.
But I mean, at the same time, I would still not really consider him a counterexample, where like his, like, he's overweight, right? Which is kind of defines Ganapati, right? Kind of like Buddha, which is interestingly another name for Ganapati or Ganesh. Ganapati and Ganesh is the same guy, right? And he's overweight, so he has, a big chest, let's say, right? That's effeminate, right? And he's very like heavy, right? Like almost like a pregnant mother.
Elephant head.
Yeah. And I just think, and he's asexual. So you wonder if that's not like he's sufficiently effeminate to kind of make him, androgynous, right? And so maybe that's like psychologically or something along those lines. Well, then he's okay to just be a single part, right? He doesn't need a female counterpart because he's already quite effeminate, right?
Wow.
In fact,
I know a fair amount about Hinduism, but I'm not super familiar on Ganesh. But yeah, that's good. I'll have to ask my Hindu friends about Ganesh.
Yeah, which I think that's incredibly interesting.
But have you studied much Hinduism? We could have a whole conversation about Hinduism. Maybe not today, but
yeah. No, yeah. The figure of Ganesh is quite interesting, right? Where like if he's your central god, everything exists within like the whole macrocosm is in the belly of Ganapati.
Okay.
Right, which is another word for Ganesh. But yeah, that's its whole other thing.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be going to India in October, and I've always studied Shiva a lot, and there's direct parallels between the goddesses of the Old Testament and the Hindu goddesses. So, so Shiva is with Parvati. Parvati is a mother goddess. I think Parvati is a direct parallel to Asherah. Durga is a warrior maiden. She's a direct counterpart to. So you got these. The triple goddess is a theme. It's a repeating theme. So mother, maiden, and death, or mother, maiden, and crone. It's a repeating motif in many different traditions. So in the Hindus, you've got there's actually multiple triple goddesses, but Parvati, Durga, and Kali are considered a triple goddess. Parvati is the mother, Durga is the daughter, who's a warrior maiden, and then Kali, if you're familiar with Kali, she's the one covered in blood with the skull necklace, and she's the death goddess. Well, in the Old Testament, we've got Asherah Astarte and Anat. Now, Asherah and Astarte are both named. They're the only two goddesses that are named in the Old Testament. And Astarte is generally called Ashtoreth, with the ETH just means shame. So it's shameful Astarte because she's a prostitute. But then Anat is, we never knew about her until they found modern archaeology in the Ugaritic text. Anat is the spouse of Baal, the sister wife of Baal, the king of the gods for the Canaanites. And she is like Kali. She's covered in blood. She's a death goddess. She's got all the same dress up. She's a skull necklace, a belt of human hands. She just slaughters with delight. She loves killing and just delights in slaughtering soldiers by the thousand and wallowing in their blood. And, you know, it's like really gory stuff, man. She loves it. She's like orgasmic to, just send the soldiers' heads rolling like balls and bowling pins. Goes on and on. She's never mentioned in the Old Testament. It's very critical. They talk all about Baal and they bash Baal all the time. Now, I talked about dying, rising gods. When Baal is another dying, rising god, he's raised back by Anat. Anat is the one who raises him up. And she's really powerful. She's actually, as she goes and challenges El in their stories, she goes right up to El's face, the creator of the universe, her father, and she says, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to throw you down like a lamb and smash your skull and make your gray beard run with gore. Like, whoa, that's a tough bitch, man. She's going to say that to the creator of the universe. I'm going to smash your skull in and make your gray beard run with gore. And what is El's response to Anat? He gives her what she wants. He doesn't castigate her. He doesn't say, how dare you? He doesn't act insulted. No, he says, oh, my daughter, you're so violent. Let me give you what you want. And he totally gives it to her. And Anat runs around totally. Nobody can, even Baal, challenges Anat. She is as powerful as anybody. And when you think about it in mythological terms, at the end of the universe, she's going to be the one to eat the entire universe. This is like Kali in Hindu traditions. She's going to be the last one standing, so to speak. At the end of time, at the end of everything, it's going to be Kali that absorbs and destroys and consumes the entire universe, her father included. And so Anat plays that role. And so in the Old Testament, they go on and on about Asherah, they go on and on about Astarte, they go on and on about Baal, and they're always insulting, they're always denigrating. But Anat, they never mention her. Anat is she who must not be named, because even to name her is to give her identity and to give her power. And you have to acknowledge her existence, and you have to acknowledge this character who is in fact more powerful than El, who can walk right up to El and poke him in the chest and and insult him and threaten him with violence and say that she's going to smash his skull in. Can you imagine a character that's going to walk up to God and threaten to smash his skull in? And then his response is like, oh, you're right.
Yeah.
And so they're terrified of her, and they can't, that's why they don't name her, because not even to insult her. They don't even name her to insult her. Because you can't name her. To name something is very powerful in mythological terms, because to name something is to make it real, and to give it identity, to give it form. And so if you're trying to write a history of the world where these powerful goddesses never existed, you don't go around insulting them. You just don't name them. It's more powerful to not name them. But we know Anat is around, because she is the wife of Baal, but we wouldn't have known it prior to modern archaeology. So this is actually new information, relatively speaking. We only knew about it in the last generation. Those Ugaritic texts were only translated in the 1970s. So it's totally new scholarship by biblical standards. But Anat appears in multiple place names, and she appears in multiple the names of people. So that the word Anat appears in the Old Testament, but always as a noun referencing the name of a town or something. So we know that it was around, but we just don't know. We don't get this Kali-like character who's going to run around, because you can imagine these are like Jezebel, right? Jezebel, Queen Jezebel, who's the most reviled character in the Old Testament. Her goddess is Asherah. If you go back to the battle on Mount Carmel with Elijah, where they kill the prophets of Baal, well, Jezebel has the prophets of Asherah, and she sponsors the prophets of Asherah. And Jezebel was a real person. She's an actual historical figure. She was an actual queen of Israel. She's a Phoenician princess who marries the king of Israel, and she's a real person. And so she was worshiping all these goddesses, Asherah and Astarte and Anat. And you can only imagine. So they had a real, actual political rivalry between these prophets of Yahweh, who are these insurgents, because they end up killing her. She gets assassinated by a follower of Yahweh, Jehu, who becomes the king. And he just, one of the things that Jehu does is he desecrates the temple of Baal, and he murders everybody inside the temple. This comes along after Elijah kills the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. A little bit later, Jehu, who's a military leader, he comes on, assassinates the king, assassinates Jezebel, who was at this time queen mother. It was her son who was the king. He kills them all. And he also lures everybody into the temple of Baal, tells them we're going to have a big offering, but then locks the door and burns down the temple and kills everybody inside. So you can only imagine that historically, the followers of Baal were quite upset. This was war. This was like literal bloodshed in the streets. And so they would have been praying to Anat to go and take out the prophets of Yahweh. And like, please, Anat, come to me, slaughter my enemies. That's exactly who they would have been praying to. The most terrible, violent figure they can imagine is Anat. But she does not get mentioned. She doesn't get mentioned in the biblical narrative.
Yeah. And there's kind of no wrathful female figure in the biblical tradition, is there?
No, there's very few women voices in the Old Testament. There's a handful. There's a handful of prophetesses. Miriam is another interesting story. Miriam, the brother of Moses, or the sister of Moses and Aaron, the older sister, the one who places Moses in the basket when he's an infant and steers him into. She's the one who's responsible for getting him into the Egyptian royal household. And she is, she's the leader of the women. She's a prophetess. She's one of the few. There's only a handful of characters that actually speak directly to God in the entire Old Testament. It's like, I forget you can count it. It's like 20 or something. It's a very finite number of people who have a face-to-face encounters with God himself. But Miriam is one of them. Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, they all three speak to God directly. And Miriam had been the leader of the women, but then something happens later on in the narrative, and for some mysterious reason, she gets in an argument with Moses, and then God punishes her with leprosy, and they send her out of the camp, and then she disappears from the narrative, and she only gets mentioned one more time, which is her funeral. So we don't really know why. What happened to Miriam? What was the nature of this argument? What were they fighting about? What had Moses done? They talk about his Cushite wife, but it's all very ambiguous. Who is this woman? Is it Zipporah, who's Moses' wife traditionally? Is it a second wife? Had Zipporah died, or are they just talking about Zipporah? What's going on here? That story is long. Scholars have long said that story of Miriam is very strange. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and the details aren't clear. And it's not clear at all what they're fighting about. But we do know that there's a dispute and that Miriam gets punished. My theory, personally, is that Miriam is another one of these Kadesha. Moses was also a pagan priest, or Aaron was a pagan priest. That's what the golden calf is all about. That represents El, the bull of heaven. And then I think Miriam, as a leader of the women, is almost certainly a holy woman too. And when they throw Miriam out, it's one of these stories referencing that they're trying to end these traditions. They're trying to put the Kadesha out of business. They want to get the priestesses out of the temple and all of their traditions that the men aren't approving of. And I think Miriam is one of these characters, personally. I think there's a couple Kadesha. There's Gomer, I mentioned with Hosea, and then there's Judah and Tamar. So Tamar, has a Kadesha role. They call her a Kadesha. They use the word Kadesha with Tamar. And then Miriam, I think, is also a Kadesha.
Gotcha.
So anyway, what time we got? 11:40. I'm gonna have to cut out here for too long here.
All right. So here, maybe we can start wrapping up.
I got a couple more minutes.
Yep. So, let's see. Wanted to go into swoon theory, where one, random question I thought on your ideas with this is that, I remember seeing a documentary with the FLDS, this polygamous group.
Right.
And they believe that the women at the tomb were Jesus' wives. Have you ever thought of that? Is that
Yeah, I mean, lots of people speculate about Mary Magdalene being Jesus' wife.
Mhm.
Personally, my personal take on that whole thing is I think Jesus is chaste. I don't think Jesus is having sex. And I think
Yeah.
if Jesus was having sex, they would have been married. I think they have a chaste relationship.
Mhm.
I think it's a teacher-student relationship. I don't think Mary Magdalene is his wife.
Yeah.
I don't think they have children. Um, that's my personal reading of it all. And I think a big
Yep.
thing about Christianity is chastity. I think that's a big part of what makes Christianity popular at this point in time. I was saying that women farther back in time were in charge of sex and in charge of all those ritual prostitution. They kept the money, they had the authority. But by the time you get to the late Roman era, that those days are over. They still have prostitution and temple prostitution, but at this point,
Mhm.
the men have taken it over, and the men are pimping out the women, and the women are just kind of being run over by the men. The women are expected to be monogamous to their husbands, but the husbands aren't expected to be monogamous to their wives. The women are like basically being, because Roman sexuality was basically wide open. There was no sexual morality. A man of any kind of wealth could basically stick
Mhm.
it wherever he damn well pleased into whoever he wanted. Men,
Mhm.
women, whatever, children. Like there was no sexual morality in the Roman era or sexual morality, right? So I think a big part of the appeal for Christianity for women in the early days is that they are going to bring some sexual morality. They are going to tell their husbands to be monogamous. They are going to like say, because if the women aren't benefiting from prostitution, if they're not keeping the money, then there's no benefit at all. They're just being taken advantage of. So I think in
Mhm.
this era, the women are very keen to put an end to prostitution because it's just something their men are doing that the women don't have any benefit from. It's just their men screwing around with some concubine and giving money, household money to some other woman. Like there's no
Mhm.
benefit to the women at all. And so they're very keen, this is my theory, in the early days of Christianity to bring up this sexual morality and chastity and bring in chastity as a moral virtue because it ends up being women that imposes on other women at the end of the day. Um, and so I think that this is my notion is that a big part of the appeal of Christianity in the early days is sexual chastity, and
Yeah.
that so I do strongly believe that Jesus was chaste. I strongly believe that he was not married to Mary Magdalene, and there's just nothing in the Gnostic text either that indicates
Yeah.
there's a one passing reference where he kisses Mary Magdalene, but the sentence is all fragmentary, so
Yeah.
we don't know the context or even the complete sentence, and that could mean anything. You know, a kiss on the cheek, it could be anything.
Yeah.
It
Well,
doesn't
there's
involve.
one reference in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene where James, I think, says Christ loved you more than all women. So, I mean, if you want to read into that, I'm sure you can. But if they wanted to say that was his wife, then they probably would have said that, right? And I would
Yeah,
take that.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
that wouldn't have been ambiguous if they were married.
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah, I'm thinking that's an attempt to associate her with the apostle that Jesus loved, right? To that she's the prominent disciple.
yeah, I mean,
And
in Gnostic tradition, she's the apostle to the apostles. She is the most
yeah,
important
she's
apostle.
the only one who gets it. All the other ones, like you had mentioned, are like just totally clueless. Like, oh yeah, to gain the kingdom of heaven, you have to be born again. And then the apostles say, well, but I'm a full grown man. How can I re-enter my mother and be born again? And then they're like, you fool, like that's a metaphor, right?
Yeah, they're a
Or
bunch of rubes, man. They're completely a bunch of
like
rubes.
it's just like it just like all the stories, like I never thought about that until it was pointed out that they just feed the 500 and then there's another feeding miracle shortly after that. And then they're like, well, how are we going to feed all these people? Weren't you there a week ago when we did? Like, and just not getting, or like they're with the Savior talking about deep stuff. And then what Peter and James are arguing about who's the bigger boss of this setup, right? Like just totally, like you don't get it, right? But Mary, in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, like she's the only one who gets it, and she's explaining it to everybody, right?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
Gospel of Thomas, right? Same setup.
Yeah, the Gnostic texts are mind blowing, and this is a thing where like the last 150 years of archaeology and scholarship have completely transformed Christianity and presented huge challenges to orthodoxy. I mean, it's really really tough to take the Bible stuff literally with everything we know now. I mean, you go back 200 years to 1820, like when Thomas Jefferson died, they didn't have access to any of this information that we have now. None of it. They hadn't even begun doing archaeology. And literally the only records they had of the ancient world at all was the Bible and Greek and Roman sources. That's it. And the Greek and Roman sources were mostly fragmentary because the Christians had gone and burned most of it. And it's only what had been preserved by the Muslims that was then later on translated back into European languages from Muslim texts. So like in the colonial era, we just didn't have any of this information. If they didn't know anything, they just didn't like literally have any of the scholarship. But now they found the Ugaritic text and the Nag Hammadi library and Dead Sea Scrolls and all this stuff that just lends all the Mesopotamian mythology, the older flood stories, all this stuff that puts the Bible into a completely different context. And you can't just like to read the Bible literally now is it's like an exercise in intentional ignorance. I mean, it's really, you have to like just dismiss all this other stuff to even attempt to read the Bible literally. Now, I was very thankful. I was raised in a church where we were not taught to read the Bible literally. I was taught to read the Bible figuratively. It was a Presbyterian church. I didn't know the term at the time, but it comes out of the school of the 19th century rationalists. And I was taught in Sunday school to, look for naturalistic explanations behind all of the myths. So that you mentioned the loaves and fishes story. The way we understood it, the way I understood it as a kid was that it was like a big potluck. Like they busted out a couple, they got 500 people there. The disciples were like, well, you got a couple loaves, a couple fishes. Anybody else got anything else? And the people were like, oh, I brought a little, because like people are coming out for a picnic. They were not like expecting to get fed. Everybody had brought their own food. And so people start sharing and they start like, oh, I got a little bit here, I got a little bit there. And then before you know it, there's more than enough food for everybody. And the moral lesson I was taught was to like be generous and be sharing and how nice it is when everyone shares. And like that was the lesson I took that I was taught in Sunday school of what that story was all about.
Yeah.
And so I was trained to like, as a kid, to read the Bible in this way, to look for a naturalistic explanation behind all these stories. And that informs the way I read it today too.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And I would wonder, I'm not sure what's going on with that story. Although we have the fish, I'm thinking there's probably astrological significance to it, right? There's Pisces, there's the bread, we might say Virgo, who's holding a sheath of wheat, that there's something to do with Pisces and Virgo there. But I don't get it. Why maybe the number is significant, right?
All right, how about one last thing before we go?
Oh, yeah.
How about the Last Supper and the Eucharist? Any notions on that? Because it's not Jewish. Whatever the Eucharist is, that you're drinking my blood and eating my flesh, that is not a Jewish tradition.
No, 100%.
That is whatever, it's come from someplace else.
Yeah, I could take a stab at it, and then I'll let you go after maybe if you want to take a stab at it. But so we have the 12, which is probably a zodiac reference, right? It might be from Mithraism, where Mithras ascends to the heaven after slaying the bull. So, I mean, maybe we have slaying of the lamb, something to do with that. And then when Mithras feasts with the soul, right, the sun god, after the ascension.
Okay.
Maybe there's some parallel with that.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate myself. I don't claim to know, but there's some people speculate that the Eucharist is a psychedelic tradition that they were doing.
Okay.
And that this would tap into the mystery religions and the Gnostics and stuff. And I don't know that that's true, but it's an interesting thought experiment to like, wow, maybe the wafer was like magic mushrooms.
Could be. It looks like, or cactus, where like it has at least in modern form, it has the little cross inside of it, right. Almost as if you would slice a cactus up, right? And maybe this cactus is hallucinogenic, and it's small. It's about the same size with a little cross.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know, but I find the Eucharist to be a very puzzling
Yeah.
tradition, and it's certainly not Jewish, and it certainly speaks to this blending of pagan and Jewish traditions that Christianity is clearly like steeped in the mystery religions and paganism, even the
For sure.
Orthodoxy, but the Gnostics
Yeah.
certainly were.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've seen, with the elaborate feast rituals that the Catholic Church does, like that they're doing right now.
Yeah.
Everybody, like, they're wearing their miters, they're wearing this elaborate setup. We have the bishop. There's two people holding his cloak, right, on each side. I looked at that recently and I thought that has to be, well, it doesn't have to be, but the remnants of some kind of mystery ceremony, right? Mystery ritual. But
Yeah, they absorbed
who knows?
all the cultural traditions of the era of the day. This, some stuff they purged, and other stuff they co-opted. Um, and so either you get rid of it or you co-opt it. Like the whole idea of Easter, like the springtime resurrection festival, that was
Mhm.
just a really old tradition. Like they had springtime resurrection festivals forever. I mean, that's what all these dying rising gods, they would be a springtime because it's a springtime and it's like the growth of plants. And so like the gods coming back. Um, so like those traditions were really, really old. Easter is just, and then people talk about whether Easter is named for Ishtar
Mhm.
or another goddess. Now
Yeah.
that the scholars say it's not Ishtar, it's from a different Germanic goddess named Eoster. All right, well, it's another goddess.
Yeah.
And so the yeah, there's so much of it in Christianity that is. I'm trying to think of some other examples. We talked about the Virgin Mary, Queen of Heaven. Um, you know, Christmas. Christmas time is a winter solstice. But they'll do things like bump it off the solstice so it's not astronomical anymore. They'll make it a couple days later. So now it's because it was right on
Yeah.
the solstice, then that would be too much like these other traditions. So they like move it over a couple days. You'll change these little details. China is trying to do the same thing today with the Dalai Lama. They're gonna
Yeah.
When the Dalai Lama dies, they're gonna institute. There's gonna be two Dalai Lamas because the Tibetan Buddhists will pick their own Dalai Lama from tradition, but the Chinese government's going to pick their own Dalai Lama, and they're going to try and co-opt the Buddhist traditions to make them, work with the Chinese Communist Party. So there'll be two Dalai Lamas, and so like that's an example of the ruling authorities co-opting a tradition, and you see that when Christianity becomes a state religion of Rome, and they're trying to impose. It takes time for the culture to roll over and for those traditions and holidays and beliefs to transform. It doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen in a generation. It takes
Yeah.
multiple generations and centuries. All these pagan gods become saints, because everybody in a pagan world, there was infinite gods and everybody is free to create their own gods. And you could have your household gods and your local community gods. And this guy in the neighborhood did this great thing, so we turn him into a god. Well, the Catholics just turn them into saints. And there's all sorts of like saints that do all these crazy mythological stuff, like St. Patrick and the snakes. And I'm not
Mhm.
an expert on all the saints, but
Yeah.
St. George battling the dragon. These guys would have been gods in a pagan worldview. But in the Catholic worldview, they're turned into saints. So it's all this co-opting of these traditions and cultures.
Yeah, certainly. All right. And then any final thoughts, or do we feel?
Oh, well, it's been fun. I'd be happy to do it again and talk about, we can talk about more of the stories or anything if you want to, if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. It went by pretty fast. I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. And I was doing my own podcast, but I kind of wrapped that up. It was, I just got too much other stuff to do. But I always enjoy going on other people's shows and happy to do it. And you can find me at, there's historyofthegoddess.com. I'll have to, the website's has some other stuff on there, Lost Goddess. But you can find my book on Amazon, and find me on if you can search for me on Facebook, you can find me.
Certainly. The History of the Goddess from Ice Age to the Bible. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.